Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the North Carolina Appalachians. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time when you are listening to this narration. We are interested in knowing what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the winter of 1957, Robert Caldwell, a surveyor for the North Carolina Highway Commission, stumbled upon a hidden cache of journals, photographs, and newspaper clippings while assessing land for a new mountain road near Boone. The discovery occurred during an unusually cold February morning when Caldwell's equipment struck something metallic beneath a rockfall that had likely been dislodged by recent freezing and thawing cycles. The container, a military ammunition box sealed with paraffin wax, had preserved its contents remarkably well, despite decades of exposure to the elements. According to Caldwell's statement, preserved in the State Archives of North Carolina, he initially assumed he had found a moonshiner's hidden supplies, or perhaps Civil War relics, both common discoveries in the Appalachian wilderness. Instead, the box contained meticulously organized documentation of events that occurred in 1920 to 1921 inches, a remote hollow known locally as Warren's Gap, approximately 7 miles from the nearest settlement. The materials revealed the existence of a man named Sawyer Warren, whose presence had been methodically erased from local records and histories following the events of 1921. Caldwell, disturbed by the contents, immediately reported his find to his supervisor, who contacted the Watauga County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Thomas McBride, nearing retirement after 30 years of service, would later describe the discovery as the most unsettling case of his career. The subsequent investigation, conducted jointly by state police and local authorities, pieced together a narrative so disturbing that official reports were sealed by court order until 1975. What Caldwell uncovered that cold February morning would lead to one of the most disturbing investigations in Appalachian history, one that would remain largely undocumented for decades. The contents of that metal box, now carefully preserved in climate-controlled conditions at the North Carolina Historical Society, revealed a chapter of mountain history that locals had deliberately tried to forget, a darkness that had festered in isolated hollows while the wider world moved forward, unaware of the horror that had unfolded among the ancient peaks and shadowed valleys. Sawyer Warren appears in the isolated community of Piney Creek in early 1920, arriving on a bitter January morning when frost coated the pines like funeral shrouds. He presented himself as a former medical orderly from the Great War, seeking peace in the mountains, his soft-spoken manner and knowledge of medicine initially welcomed in a region where qualified health care remained scarce. County records preserved in the courthouse archives show he purchased 40 acres of steep, wooded land for a surprisingly generous sum from Martha Blackwood, an elderly widow desperate to leave the area after her husband's mysterious death the previous autumn. The property, situated in a narrow hollow approximately 7 miles from the nearest neighbor, contained a modest 2-room cabin, a small barn, and a root cellar dug deep into the hillside. According to statements gathered during the 1957 investigation and preserved in state police files, Warren was described by locals as a man of particular habits and reserved disposition who rarely participated in community gatherings, yet maintained impeccable manners during his infrequent visits to the general store for supplies. Elijah Thompson, who operated the store until his death in 1954, noted in his journal that Warren always paid in cash, often with gold coins that seemed unusually worn, as if from extensive handling. His purchases frequently included unusual quantities of salt, alcohol, and chemical compounds that Warren claimed were for preserving botanical specimens he collected from the surrounding forests. His background appears unremarkable at first glance. His military discharge papers properly stamped, his references from a Philadelphia hospital appropriately letterheaded. Yet, archival research conducted decades later reveals disturbing discrepancies in his claimed history. No record exists of a Sawyer Warren serving in any medical unit during the war. The Philadelphia hospital mentioned in his references had been destroyed in a fire 2 years before the date on his letter of recommendation, and birth records show no one of that name born in the Ohio town he claimed as his birthplace. These discrepancies, seemingly minor administrative details that escaped notice in the chaotic post-war years, might have raised critical alarms had they been discovered in 1920, potentially saving countless lives from the methodical horror that would unfold in that remote hollow over the following 3 decades, hidden behind the respectable facade of a soft-spoken man who claimed to have devoted his life to healing the wounded. Warren's property, situated in a narrow valley surrounded by dense forest and rocky ridges that cast long shadows even at midday, becomes the site of his methodically constructed homestead during the spring and summer of 1920. He builds a modest cabin of hand-hewn oak logs with river stone foundations, positioning it to remain partially hidden from the seldom-used dirt track that served as the only access to the property. Local carpenter James Harmon, hired briefly to assist with roofing, later recalled that Warren insisted on completing certain aspects of the construction entirely alone, particularly the modifications to the existing root cellar, which Warren claimed needed extensive reinforcement against the region's frequent flooding. This cellar, originally a simple excavation beneath the previous owner's cabin, was expanded substantially under Warren's direction. Its depth increased to nearly 15 feet, according to surveys conducted during the subsequent investigation, with multiple chambers branching from the main space like fingers reaching into the hillside. The isolation was not unusual for the area, where homesteads could be miles apart, separated by dense oak and hickory forests, limestone outcroppings, and steep hollows that made travel difficult even in favorable weather. The Appalachians had long been a place where people came to disappear, whether from the law, from debts, or simply from society itself, a quality that local histories suggest attracted Warren specifically to Piney Creek rather than more accessible communities further east. Throughout 1921 and 1922, Warren continued making improvements to his property, installing an elaborate system for collecting and storing rainwater, constructing a workshop separate from the main cabin where he claimed to prepare his botanical specimens, and establishing what appeared to be a small medical dispensary where he occasionally treated locals for minor ailments, building trust within the community. Most notable among these improvements, though unremarked upon at the time, were the unusual reinforcements added to his cellar entrance: a heavy oak door with iron banding secured by 3 separate locks of German manufacture, hardware far more substantial than would be necessary to secure preserved foods and household goods. Similarly concerning in retrospect was the ventilation system he installed throughout the underground chambers. Copper pipes, extending from the cellar to emerge, disguised among natural rock formations some distance from the cabin, allowing air circulation that would later be recognized as essential for his true purposes. These modifications, viewed by occasional visitors as merely the eccentricities of a solitary man with technical knowledge beyond local standards, would later be recognized by investigators as signs of his sinister preparations, a carefully designed facility for activities so horrific that even hardened state police officers would request transfers after examining the site in 1957. November 1920 marks the first documented disappearance connected to Warren's property, though its significance would not be recognized until decades later, when investigators painstakingly reconstructed the pattern of vanishings that plagued the region. James Holcomb, a timber buyer for the Appalachian Lumber Company based in Knoxville, departed from Asheville on November 12th, with plans to assess virgin hardwood stands in 3 counties before returning for Thanksgiving. Company records show his last communication was a telegram sent from Marshall on November 17th, stating his intention to travel through Warren's Gap the following day en route to his final appointments in Tennessee. According to correspondence preserved in the company archives and later recovered during the 1957 investigation, Holcomb never arrived at his destination, prompting his employer to send increasingly urgent inquiries to postmasters and sheriffs throughout the region. With winter approaching and mountain passes becoming treacherous under early snow, the investigation remained perfunctory, consisting primarily of telegrams and a single deputy dispatched to retrace Holcomb's likely route. The timber buyer's leather satchel containing contracts and company funds was discovered the following spring by a local hunter approximately 2 miles from Warren's property, a blade weathered by exposure but with its contents largely intact. Local law enforcement, consisting primarily of aging Sheriff Thomas Blackburn and 2 deputies responsible for policing an entire county of remote hollows and isolated communities, noted the disappearance in their quarterly report, but ultimately attributed it to the numerous hazards of mountain travel during the onset of winter. Holcomb's horse was never recovered, nor was his body, circumstances that aroused little suspicion in a region where steep ravines and dense undergrowth could conceal such evidence indefinitely. This established a pattern that would repeat with disturbing frequency over the coming months and years, a pattern documented only fragmentarily in official records, but preserved more completely in local memory and private correspondence. Martha Simmons, who maintained the county's only boarding house in the town of Marshall, noted in her personal diary entries from this period the unusual frequency with which travelers would depart toward the northern reaches of the county, including the area surrounding Warren's property, only to never complete their journeys. The diary, discovered among her effects after her death in 1946, contains a particularly chilling entry from December 1922. 3 commercial travelers this season alone have taken the northern route and vanished completely. Sheriff Blackburn suggests winter conditions, but we had milder weather this year than any in my memory. Something else hunts in those hollows. How many more must disappear before someone investigates properly? The winter of 1920 to 1921 is remembered as particularly severe in the North Carolina mountains, a season of bitter cold and relentless snowfall that transformed the already isolated landscape into an impassable wilderness. Weather records from the Asheville Weather Bureau, preserved in the National Archives, document snowfall totaling over 80 inches between December and March, with accumulations in higher elevations likely exceeding 10 feet in drifted areas. Temperatures plummeted well below zero on 17 recorded occasions, reaching negative 23 degrees Fahrenheit during a particularly brutal cold snap in late January that froze streams solid and killed livestock in their barns throughout the region. The few maintained roads became impassable as snow drifted higher than fence posts, effectively cutting off smaller settlements from regular contact with county seats and supply centers. Warren's homestead, already remote during favorable conditions, becomes virtually inaccessible during these months. The narrow trail leading to his property, buried beneath snow and obscured by fallen timber brought down by ice storms. Joshua Miller, who operated a small grist mill 6 miles southeast of Warren's property, noted in his personal almanac that no one from the northern hollows had visited his establishment between December 18th and March 7th, the longest period of isolation he had recorded in 15 years of operation. Yet, despite this seemingly impenetrable isolation, smoke continues to rise from Warren's chimney throughout the winter months, visible from distant ridges as a thin gray column against the white landscape, suggesting continuous occupation and activity despite conditions that had driven even lifelong mountaineers to seek more accessible shelter. Local hunters Samuel Tanner and William Crawford, interviewed in 1957 by state investigators reopening the long-dormant case, reported strange noises echoing through the valley on particularly cold nights during that winter when they had taken shelter in an abandoned hunting cabin approximately 1 mile from Warren's property. Crawford described sounds he had dismissed at the time as the cries of mountain lions or the peculiar acoustics of wind through the ridges, high-pitched wails that seemed to start and stop with unnatural suddenness, followed by periods of absolute silence. Tanner, more specific in his recollection, mentioned a rhythmic pounding that carried through the frozen air on at least 3 occasions, comparing it to the sound of a steel hammer striking wood but with unusual regularity, continuing well past midnight despite the bitter cold that would have driven most sensible men indoors. These accounts, which both men had mentioned only casually to neighbors at the time, took on profoundly more sinister implications when considered alongside evidence discovered during the subsequent investigation, suggesting activity within Warren's isolated compound, of a nature far different than the simple pursuit of solitude he had claimed motivated his retreat to the mountains. By spring 1921, as mountain passes cleared and travel became possible again, observant neighbors began to notice peculiarities in Warren's behavior that individually might seem merely eccentric, but collectively formed a pattern that would later haunt investigators. He makes increasingly frequent trips to Boone for supplies, his wagon returning laden with unusual quantities of chemical preservatives, specialized tools, and medical supplies that seem excessive for a solitary mountain dweller with no formal practice. Thomas Jenkins, who operated the Watauga General Store from 1915 to 1937, maintained meticulous records of all transactions in leather-bound ledgers discovered during courthouse renovations in 1963. These documents, now preserved in county archives, show Warren's purchasing patterns shifting dramatically in April and May 1921. Where his earlier purchases had focused on typical homesteading necessities, his new acquisitions included 5 gallons of formaldehyde, unusual quantities of calcium chloride, and new setting Carter so 4 specialized surgical instruments including bone saws and cranial drills, and 3 different types of restraints ostensibly for trapping animals. Most concerning, according to testimony gathered in 1957 from Elijah Winters, who had delivered lumber to the property, is the extensive renovation of what Warren continued to call his root cellar, despite modifications that seemed excessive for storing preserves. Winters described Warren personally supervising the installation of a reinforced subfloor constructed of oak planking 3 inches thick, the addition of copper pipes extending from the underground chamber to ventilation points concealed among rocks 50 yards from the main structure, and most notably, the installation of an elaborate iron door with a German-made locking mechanism requiring 3 separate keys to open. The door itself weighed nearly 200 pounds, according to Winters, who required help from 2 additional men to position it properly. An extraordinary security measure for a structure supposedly containing only preserved foods and household goods. Equally troubling in retrospect was Warren's explanation for these unusual purchases and modifications. Jenkins recalled Warren explaining his acquisition of medical equipment and preservatives as necessary for preserving the unique botanical and zoological specimens he was collecting for scientific research, claiming correspondence with a prestigious Eastern university that had commissioned his work. When pressed by the naturally curious storekeeper about the nature of this research, Warren reportedly became guarded, stating only that his work involved studying the effects of isolation and extreme conditions on living tissue, a description that Jenkins found odd but not alarming enough to report to authorities. Warren paid for these substantial purchases with gold coins of unusual vintage, their origin never explained, but their value sufficient to eliminate any commercial resistance to his increasingly strange requests. Summer brings increased traffic through the mountains as 1921 progresses, with travelers seeking cooler air and scenic vistas that offered respite from the sweltering conditions in lowland cities to the east. Warren's once isolated homestead, positioned near a secondary trail connecting 2 more established routes, begins receiving occasional visitors seeking directions or brief rest. According to journal entries and correspondence collected during the subsequent investigation, Warren's demeanor transforms during this period, his previous reticence giving way to a calculated hospitality that neighbors found surprising, given his formerly solitary habits. He offers meals and simple lodging for those passing through, quickly gaining a modest reputation among the region's travelers for his hearty stews, prepared with wild game and distinctive coffee brewed in a peculiar copper pot he claimed to have brought back from Europe. According to statements from those who survived their visits to the homestead, recorded decades later when the true nature of Warren's activities became apparent, several travelers reported feeling unusually drowsy after partaking in his offerings, experiencing what one described as a heaviness in the limbs and unusual difficulty maintaining clear thoughts. Most continued their journeys after brief recuperation, attributing their condition to mountain fatigue or the natural effects of Warren's potent coffee. County records, when meticulously cross-referenced with hotel registries and family correspondence from surrounding communities, would later show that approximately one traveler per month who stopped at Warren's homestead never reached their intended destination during the summer of 1921, their journeys terminating in the isolated hollow without raising immediate alarm. The local postmaster in Boone, Harold Williams, would later recall Warren's increased mail orders during this period, packages and correspondence arriving regularly from medical supply companies and specialized booksellers in Philadelphia and Baltimore. Williams, whose natural curiosity led him to note the return addresses on unusual parcels passing through his office, remembered particularly a series of heavy crates from Danvers Surgical Supply requiring his personal delivery due to their weight and delicate contents. Upon bringing these packages to Warren's property in July, Williams observed newly constructed wooden platforms behind the main cabin where several items of clothing were being aired, and including what appeared to be city attire unsuitable for mountain living, an observation he mentioned casually to his wife but did not connect to the region's missing travelers until questioned specifically during the 1957 investigation. In August 1921, Catherine Mitchell, a school teacher from Asheville visiting relatives in Piney Creek during her summer recess, encounters Warren at Tompkins General Store while purchasing supplies for her extended stay. Something about his demeanor disturbs her deeply, a visceral reaction she could not immediately articulate but which lingered long after their brief interaction. In letters to her sister Elizabeth, preserved among family papers and discovered during a state liquidation in 1960, she describes Warren as meticulously polite, yet somehow wrong, like a man wearing an ill-fitting suit of human behavior. His words and gestures seemed studied rather than natural, as though he had learned human interaction from a manual rather than through genuine connection. Though he spoke with perfect courtesy, inquiring about her teaching position and expressing interest in educational developments in larger communities, Mitchell noted that his eyes remained utterly vacant during their exchange, observing rather than participating in the conversation. Her journal entries, donated to the North Carolina State Archives in 1962 by her nephew following the reopening of the investigation, document her growing suspicions with remarkable prescience. On August 17th, she writes of meeting Charles and Mary Whitaker, a young couple from Tennessee traveling through the region on their honeymoon journey, spending an afternoon showing them local landmarks and suggesting scenic routes for their continued travels. When the couple fails to return from a day trip that would have taken them near Warren's property, Mitchell becomes increasingly concerned, noting their planned itinerary would have placed them on the trail, passing directly by his homestead around midday. Her initial inquiries to local authorities received polite but dismissive responses, Sheriff Blackburn suggesting the couple likely continued their journey without informing acquaintances of such brief duration. Mitchell begins asking uncomfortable questions that the tight-knit community proves reluctant to address, noting in her August 23rd entry, "No one wishes to speak directly about the homesteader in the North Hollow, yet their silences, when his name arises, speak volumes. When I mentioned the missing couple to Mr. Jenkins at the store, his eyes immediately flicked toward Warren's usual shelf of supplies, then away, before changing the subject entirely. These people know something they fear to articulate." Mitchell's persistence leads her to compile a rudimentary list of travelers reported missing in the region over the previous year, a document that appears in her journal as a simple column of names and approximate dates that would later prove remarkably accurate when compared with official investigations. Her final entry regarding Warren, dated September 2nd before her return to Asheville, reads, "I leave tomorrow but cannot shake the conviction that something unspeakable dwells in that hollow. I shall write to the state authorities upon my return." A detailed examination of Warren's property, conducted during the 1957 investigation after decades of accumulated suspicion, finally prompted official action, reveals the true purpose of his expanded root cellar that had long concealed horrors beneath the ordinary appearance of a mountain homestead. State police photographs preserved in evidence files document the underground structure with clinical precision, showing a complex facility extending nearly 30 feet into the hillside, its carefully engineered chambers belying Warren's claimed identity as a simple medical orderly. The main chamber, approximately 15 feet square with a ceiling reinforced by timber supports, contained specialized areas for different activities that left no doubt about the nature of Warren's true work. The eastern section featured a sloped stone floor with drainage channels cut precisely into the native rock, leading to a collection basin where traces of human blood remained detectable despite decades of use and attempts at cleaning. Adjacent to this area stood a heavy oak table fitted with leather restraints positioned at precise intervals. The leather, worn and darkened with substances that laboratory analysis would later confirm as bodily fluids from multiple individuals. The northern wall held shelves lined with glass jars containing preserved specimens that investigating officers initially believed to be animal organs until medical examiners identified them as human in origin, labeled with dates and notations in Warren's distinctive handwriting. Most disturbing was a small workroom in the southwestern corner containing surgical implements arranged with obsessive precision on a rolling cart of hospital design, including specialized tools for cranial and spinal procedures that even the examining medical professionals could not immediately identify. According to the forensic report filed with the State Bureau of Investigation on the 12th of October 1957, the facility suggested medical training far beyond that of a wartime orderly, indicating education and experience consistent with advanced surgical specialization, possibly of European origin based on the design and manufacture of certain instruments. The investigation uncovers evidence that Warren was systematically conducting experiments on human subjects over a period spanning at least 3 decades, documenting his findings in meticulous journals recovered from a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of his main cabin. These 17 leather-bound volumes, their pages filled with precisely rendered anatomical drawings and densely written observations, revealed a mind both brilliant and profoundly disturbed, focused particularly on neurological responses to various stimuli and what Warren termed the physical parameters of consciousness transition at the moment of death. Among the materials discovered in 1957 is Warren's ledger, a leather-bound volume recovered from beneath a loose floorboard in his workshop, its pages filled with handwriting as precise and measured as its horrific contents. The book represents a meticulously kept record of his guests, dating from November 1920 through September 1921, and the formal accounting of human suffering rendered with the dispassionate clarity of a business inventory. Each entry follows an identical format, beginning with a name, date of arrival, and comprehensive physical description, including height, weight, coloring, and distinguishing characteristics, noted with unsettling attention to detail. These initial observations give way to more disturbing assessments of suitability and tolerance, clinical terms that investigators would later determine referred to qualities Warren sought in his subjects, particularly their resilience during his experiments and procedures. The ledger contains 27 entries for this initial period alone, though subsequent investigations would suggest the actual number of victims may have been significantly higher based on remains recovered from multiple sites around the property and gaps in the chronology, suggesting additional undocumented cases. Most chilling are the methodical notations following each name, documenting reactions to various procedures with the detached precision of laboratory notes, complete with timestamps, measurements of physiological responses, and observations of deterioration recorded in 15-minute intervals. James Holcomb, the timber buyer whose November 1920 disappearance marked Warren's first documented victim, merited 3 full pages of observations, culminating in a final notation reading simply, "Subject expired at 0417 following procedure C. Results inconclusive, requiring further refinement of technique." According to analysis by Dr. Thomas Blackwood of the University of North Carolina's Department of Forensic Psychology, who reviewed the materials at the request of state authorities, the clinical detachment with which Warren documented his victims suggests a complete absence of empathy, combined with a distorted scientific curiosity that characterized the most dangerous category of criminal psychology. In his 40-page assessment submitted to investigators in December 1957, Blackwood noted that Warren exhibited none of the emotional satisfaction or sadistic pleasure typical of many violent offenders, instead approaching his victims with the methodical interest of a researcher, a dangerous combination that allowed him to view human beings as mere research subjects whose suffering held significance only in its scientific documentation. Most disturbing to investigators was the evident progression visible in the ledger entries, with Warren's notations showing increasing sophistication in both his techniques and his anatomical knowledge as the months progressed, suggesting a systematic approach to perfecting whatever horrific procedures he conducted in that hidden underground chamber. By early September 1921, Catherine Mitchell's suspicions have crystallized into certainty, her initial unease hardening into conviction that something profoundly wrong was occurring in the isolated hollow where Warren had established himself. Her letters to both her sister and the county superintendent detail her plan to alert authorities in Boone, documenting with growing frustration the resistance she faces from locals who prefer not to invite outside scrutiny into community matters. In a particularly revealing letter dated September 8th, she writes, "The silence surrounding the disappearances has become an almost tangible presence in this town. When I mentioned my concerns to Sheriff Blackburn directly, he advised me that mountain travelers often change routes without notice and suggested I concern myself with educational matters rather than pursuing groundless suspicions against a respected neighbor." According to telegrams preserved in the county sheriff's office and later entered into evidence, Mitchell successfully contacts the state police headquarters in Raleigh on September 12, 1921, bypassing local authorities entirely. Her detailed report, transcribed by the receiving officer as urgent communication regarding pattern of disappearances and suspicious circumstances in Watauga County, prompts immediate action despite jurisdictional complications. Captain James Hargrove, commanding the Western District, dispatches officers Thomas Sullivan and Robert Freeman to investigate, noting in his order that the systematic nature of the reported disappearances warranted immediate attention regardless of local sentiment. The officers arrive in Piney Creek on September 14th after an arduous journey by automobile and horseback, meeting briefly with Mitchell to gather additional details before proceeding to Warren's homestead. What they discover upon arriving at the isolated property will shock even these hardened law enforcement officials who had between them investigated dozens of homicides across the state. According to Officer Sullivan's initial report, transmitted by telegraph on September 15th, they approached the cabin to find smoke rising from the chimney, but received no response to their announcements. Entering with weapons drawn, they discovered Warren in the midst of what Sullivan described as a procedure of unimaginable barbarity involving a male victim later identified as Henry Colson, a cattle buyer from Tennessee reported missing 3 days earlier. The scene, documented in official reports with reluctant but necessary detail, revealed Warren's true nature and activities with horrifying clarity, setting in motion a manhunt across the southern Appalachians when the perpetrator escaped through a concealed rear exit during the ensuing confusion, disappearing into the vast wilderness that had sheltered his activities for nearly a year. When state police arrive at Warren's property on the 15th of September 1921, they find evidence of hasty departure that suggests he received warning of their approach, possibly from sympathetic locals who observed the officer's arrival in the area. The cabin stands abandoned, but with clear signs of recent occupation, evidence of flight rather than planned departure. The official report, filed by Officers Sullivan and Freeman and preserved in the North Carolina State Archives, describes still warm ashes in the fireplace, a half-consumed meal on the kitchen table, and a rear door left ajar, swinging gently in the mountain breeze. Most telling was the disarray in Warren's normally immaculate workspace, drawers left open with contents partially removed, suggesting he had taken only essential items before fleeing into the surrounding wilderness. According to their meticulously documented investigation, the officers descend into the underground chamber, expecting perhaps evidence of moonshining or other common mountain illegalities, only to discover horrors beyond their experienced imaginations. The report, portions of which remain sealed even decades later due to their disturbing content, details the discovery of partial human remains in various stages of dissection, preserved specimens in labeled jars arranged chronologically, and detailed anatomical drawings showing a progression of experimental procedures focused primarily on the central nervous system. Most damning are the journals recovered from a locked cabinet, their pages filled with observations of what Warren termed subjects showing timestamps, measurements, and clinical notations about responses to various stimuli. A manhunt ensues immediately, with Sullivan remaining at the property to secure evidence, while Freeman rides to the nearest telephone in Boone to request additional officers from 3 counties. Within 24 hours, nearly 30 law enforcement personnel converge on the area, supplemented by local hunting guides familiar with the terrain. Bloodhounds borrowed from the county prison farm initially track Warren's scent along a game trail heading northwest before losing it completely at Grandfather River, suggesting he may have followed the waterway to avoid detection, possibly traveling partially submerged to eliminate his scent trail. The pursuit continues for 17 days across some of the most challenging terrain in the eastern United States, when AD, with search parties reporting occasional signs of temporary camps and once discovering the remains of a small fire estimated to be less than 6 hours old. His knowledge of the wilderness, documented in journals found at his property that contain detailed observations of local geography and survival techniques, gives him advantages that conventional law enforcement lacks, despite their superior numbers. Captain Hargrove, writing in his summary report dated October 3rd, notes with evident frustration. The suspect's familiarity with these mountains, combined with his apparent preparation for potential flight, has created circumstances where traditional manhunt approaches prove ineffective. He moves through this wilderness with the confidence of a native inhabitant while leaving minimal trace of his passage. As investigators process the scene at Warren's homestead throughout late September 1921, the true extent of his activities becomes horrifyingly clear, each discovered item adding new dimensions to the emerging nightmare. According to forensic reports compiled by Dr. Samuel Harrison, who traveled from Raleigh to assist local authorities, evidence suggests Warren had been systematically drugging travelers using a compound containing belladonna and opium derivatives, traces of which were found in his distinctive copper coffee pot. Chemical analysis of residues discovered in food storage containers revealed similar substances in varying concentrations, suggesting careful calibration for different purposes. The underground chambers, when fully excavated, yielded evidence of at least 32 victims based on distinctive personal effects cataloged by investigators, though the actual number was likely higher, given indications that Warren disposed of remains in multiple remote locations throughout the surrounding wilderness. Most disturbing are journal entries indicating that many victims remained conscious during his procedures, Warren having developed techniques to immobilize subjects while maintaining their awareness, a refinement he documented with clinical precision as producing optimal observational data regarding pain thresholds and nervous system responses. His journals, spanning 7 volumes and nearly 800 pages, detail experiments related to human endurance, systematic investigation of pain thresholds across different demographic groups, and meticulous documentation of anatomical variations he discovered through dissection. The specialized knowledge revealed in his notes, particularly regarding neuroanatomy and surgical techniques, leads investigators to question his background claims. Records retrieved from military archives in Washington confirm what Catherine Mitchell had initially suspected. No medical orderly, named Sawyer Warren, had served during the Great War in any capacity. Further investigation through international channels eventually connects fingerprints found throughout the property to one Anton Chrysler, a former medical student at the University of Vienna who had disappeared in 1913 following allegations of unauthorized experiments on morgue specimens. Austrian authorities provide documentation showing Chrysler had studied under professors known for controversial neurological research before being dismissed for what university records termed unacceptable ethical violations and concerning fixations. A photograph from university archives, though showing a younger man than the Warren known to Piney Creek residents, contains the same distinctive eyes that Mitchell had described as utterly vacant, confirming that the mountain homesteader's identity, like so much else about him, was a carefully constructed fiction designed to provide cover for activities too horrific for his neighbors to imagine occurring in their peaceful community. Research conducted in the weeks following Warren's disappearance reveals his actual identity through a methodical investigation that extended far beyond the mountains of North Carolina. Fingerprints, carefully lifted from personal items in his cabin by state police technicians, were forwarded to federal authorities, who discovered a match in their limited but growing identification records. The prints belonged not to any Sawyer Warren, but to Dr. Samuel Whitfield, formerly a promising researcher at Johns Hopkins Medical School in Baltimore, where he had specialized in neurological trauma until his abrupt departure in 1919. According to personnel records obtained during the investigation through cooperation with university administrators, Whitfield had been summarily dismissed from the faculty following a closed inquiry into allegations of unethical research practices involving unauthorized nocturnal access to the medical school morgue and the unexplained disappearance of specimens designated for student instruction. Most concerning were records of a faculty review where Whitfield had defended his actions by claiming that conventional ethical boundaries impeded true scientific advancement. Newspaper accounts from Baltimore, preserved in city archives and obtained by investigators in October 1921, provide additional context to his dismissal, reporting that several colleagues had expressed concerns about Whitfield's increasingly erratic behavior following his return from voluntary medical service in France during the war's final months. The Baltimore Sun of the 17th of March 1919 quotes an anonymous colleague describing Whitfield as a man transformed by his wartime experiences, returning with an obsession for extending the boundaries of human endurance and pain research that transcended conventional medical ethics. The article details a research proposal Whitfield had submitted to the University Ethics Committee that was unanimously rejected for procedures described as barbaric and reminiscent of medieval torture rather than modern medicine. Dr. Harold Jenkins, who had served as Whitfield's department chair, provided a written statement to investigators describing his former colleague as brilliant but increasingly unstable in the years following the war, noting that Whitfield had developed theories about consciousness and pain that bordered on the metaphysical rather than the scientific. Most revealing was Jenkins' recollection of Whitfield's final statement before the faculty review board. The true understanding of human consciousness cannot be achieved through conventional research methods. To truly understand the mind, one must observe it at the moment it transcends physical limitations. This statement, chilling in its implications, provided investigators with insight into the motivations behind the horrors discovered in that isolated mountain hollow where a brilliant mind had pursued its twisted obsessions unfettered by oversight or ethical constraint. The revelation of Warren's crimes sends shockwaves through the isolated communities of the North Carolina mountains, transforming neighborly suspicion into collective horror as the full extent of the atrocities becomes known. According to newspaper accounts from autumn 1921, families who had previously accepted the mysterious disappearances of travelers as an unfortunate but natural consequence of the challenging mountain terrain begin to come forward with reports of missing loved ones who had traveled through the region. The Johnson family of Boone, whose son William had vanished while delivering mail to outlying communities in February, arrived at the sheriff's office with a pocket watch recovered from Warren's property that they identified as a family heirloom given to their son on his 18th birthday. The tight-knit mountain culture typically suspicious of outside interference and protective of their independence from lowland authority, cooperates fully with investigators as the magnitude of Warren's atrocities becomes clear, a transformation described by Captain Hargrove as remarkable in communities historically reluctant to involve themselves with state officials. Church meetings throughout Watauga and neighboring counties become impromptu information sessions where residents share previously unmentioned encounters with the man they knew as Warren, piecing together a community timeline of unusual behaviors that now carried sinister significance. The Watauga Democrat, which had previously dismissed Catherine Mitchell's concerns about the disappearances as outsider hysteria, publishes a full account on the 4th of October 1921, describing Warren as a monster in human form who preyed upon the trust and kindness of mountain people whose hospitality tradition had provided him perfect cover for his unspeakable activities. Editor Thomas Richardson, whose previous editorial had cautioned against hasty judgments of newcomers, writes a personal apology to Mitchell, acknowledging her persistence had likely prevented countless additional deaths. Local minister Reverend Jeremiah Holcomb, speaking to a congregation that included 3 families of identified victims, addresses the community's reluctance to involve outside authorities earlier, suggesting it reflects not just the independent spirit of the Appalachian people, but also demonstrates how isolation can provide cover for predatory behavior. Most poignant were the handwritten notices posted on general store bulletin boards throughout the region seeking information about travelers who had never reached their destinations, their simple descriptions and fading photographs testament to the far-reaching impact of Warren's crimes beyond the immediate mountain community, a web of grief extending across state lines and social boundaries. The traditional mountain code that valued privacy and self-reliance had inadvertently created perfect conditions for a predator sophisticated enough to exploit these cultural values while conducting his horrific work undetected. Despite an extensive manhunt involving state police, federal marshals, and local volunteers that extended through the autumn of 1921 and into the harsh winter months, Sawyer Warren, divided by Samuel Whitfield, is never captured, his escape becoming one of the most frustrating failures in early North Carolina law enforcement history. The last confirmed sighting occurs in late September 1921, when Jeremiah Collins, a shepherd tending flocks in the high pastures near the Tennessee border, reports encountering a man matching Warren's description emerging from dense forest at dusk, carrying a medical bag and wearing clothing too formal for the remote setting. Collins, unaware of the manhunt until returning to his village days later, recalled the stranger asking detailed questions about routes into Tennessee before disappearing into gathering darkness. According to police reports filed by Captain Hargrove on October 17th, the trail goes cold in the vast wilderness of the Great Smoky Mountains despite tracking dogs, experienced mountaineer guides, and over 60 men combing the region in systematic patterns. Weather conditions deteriorated rapidly as autumn progressed, with early snowfall obliterating potential tracks and forcing the scaling back of search operations by early November. The case file, maintained actively until 1926 before being designated cold but unresolved, documents periodic reports of a solitary man with medical knowledge surfacing in remote communities from North Georgia to West Virginia over the next several years, each investigation consuming resources but yielding no confirmation. A physician calling himself William Sanderson practiced briefly in a coal mining community in eastern Kentucky during 1922, performing surgeries of remarkable skill, before disappearing when authorities began investigating his credentials. A scholarly German immigrant offering medical services appeared in rural Tennessee communities throughout 1923, before vanishing completely when local newspapers published accounts of the North Carolina manhunt. Most intriguing was the 1924 report from a remote logging camp in West Virginia, where workers described a camp doctor whose interest in head injuries struck them as excessive, prompting one worker familiar with the Warren case to contact authorities, though the suspect had departed before investigators arrived. Warren's specialized training and wilderness skills, combined with his demonstrated capacity for assuming convincing false identities, allowed him to evade conventional pursuit through territories where strangers were rare but medical knowledge was precious enough that communities might overlook inconsistencies in background to secure needed expertise. The investigation file concludes with a theory that Warren likely established a new identity in another isolated region beyond the immediate search area, possibly leaving the Appalachian region entirely for Western territories where documentation requirements remained minimal and skilled professionals could establish themselves with few questions about their past. The impact of Warren's crimes extends far beyond the immediate victims, creating ripples through Appalachian culture that researchers would document for generations. According to sociological studies conducted by the University of North Carolina, in the 1,960 seconds, the case fundamentally altered the famously hospitable culture of the Appalachian Mountains, transforming communal attitudes toward outsiders in ways that persisted long after the details of the original crimes had faded from common knowledge. The tradition of offering shelter to travelers, once considered a sacred mountain obligation regardless of personal circumstances, declines noticeably in the decades following 1921, with researchers documenting a 40% reduction in reported instances of spontaneous hospitality to strangers compared to pre-Warren accounts. Mountain communities, already somewhat insular by necessity, developed additional protective mechanisms against outsiders, including informal warning systems when strangers entered valleys and increased emphasis on proper introductions through known associates. Dr. Eleanor Wilkins, who studied the case extensively for her 1965 book Mountain Shadows, The Warren Case and Its Cultural Impact, notes that stories of Warren became part of regional folklore, transmitted orally across generations with varying details but consistent warnings. The narrative evolved into cautionary tales told to children about the dangers of trusting strangers, referred to obliquely as the doctor in the hollow or the man with the black bag in family stories, designed to instill appropriate caution without revealing the full horror of the historical events. Elderly respondents in Wilkins' study recalled how parents who had lived through the Warren investigation would react with unusual severity to children who wandered too far from home or spoke too freely with unfamiliar visitors. Perhaps most striking is how the physical site of Warren's homestead is deliberately obscured by locals in the decades following the crimes, a conscious effort at communal forgetting documented through county records, showing the property remained unclaimed despite its agricultural potential. Local guides refuse to take outsiders to the location, mapmakers omit the access trails from official county documents, and forestry officials report that directional signs in the vicinity were repeatedly vandalized until they ceased replacing them, creating what Wilkins terms a geography of deliberate forgetting, designed to prevent the site from becoming a macabre attraction. The deliberate erasure extends to family histories, with several surnames appearing in Warren's recovered ledgers disappearing from local usage as families changed their names to avoid association with ancestral victimhood, a phenomenon Wilkins documents through county records, showing unusual numbers of legal name changes between 1,922 and 1,930. The 1,957 discovery brings renewed attention to the case when forestry workers, stumbling upon the overgrown ruins of Warren's homestead, uncover additional evidence buried beneath collapsed structural elements. But many questions remain unanswered despite the resources devoted to this second investigation. Despite extensive forensic work conducted with techniques unavailable in the 1,920 seconds, the total number of Warren's victims cannot be conclusively determined, though evidence suggests the figure exceeds 50 based on personal effects, anatomical specimens, and journal entries recovered from multiple sites. The fate of Warren himself remains one of criminology's enduring mysteries. No record of his death or capture exists in any jurisdiction, no body matching his description was ever discovered, and no conclusive evidence establishes whether he continued his activities elsewhere or eventually succumbed to the unforgiving wilderness that facilitated his escape. Most disturbing are the implications of his research notes, which suggest he was developing techniques he believed could expand the boundaries of human consciousness through controlled trauma, a methodology he documented with increasing excitement in later journal entries as approaching a breakthrough in understanding the physical parameters of the human soul. According to Dr. Blackwood's analysis, published in the Journal of Forensic Psychology in 1958, Warren appeared to be working toward some larger purpose beyond mere sadism, a distorted scientific goal combining neuroanatomical research with quasi-mystical theories about consciousness that died with him or perhaps continued in isolation beyond the reach of conventional society. In 2018, nearly a century after Warren's disappearance, hikers in the remote Linville Gorge area discover stone carvings in a previously undocumented cave system and their weathered surfaces bearing anatomical designs strikingly similar to those in Warren's journals, with dates suggesting he may have continued his work in even more isolated regions of the Appalachians for years after his escape from justice. The wilderness keeps its secrets, and somewhere in the ancient mountains, the final truth about Sawyer Warren may remain hidden forever, a shadow in the collective memory of communities still shaped by his crimes. The story of Sawyer Warren represents one of the darkest chapters in Appalachian history, a case where isolation, misplaced trust, and the human capacity for evil combined with devastating results that echo through generations. The rugged beauty of the mountains, which draws visitors to this day, once provided the perfect cover for unspeakable acts conducted by a man whose medical knowledge served not to heal, but to inflict suffering in service of his distorted vision. For those who know the tale, the winding mountain roads of western North Carolina carry an additional weight, the knowledge that even in places of natural splendor, darkness can find root and flourish when eyes are turned away from uncomfortable truths.